Hello world and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. Today we're going to be talking about Azure VMs and the storage options available to those VMs on Azure. Hi guys, today we're going to be doing a deep dive into Azure VMs, and we're going to look at the components that go into making a VM possible, and we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do with VMs on the Azure cloud as well. So what is a virtual machine anyway? It's exactly as it sounds. A virtual machine is a machine where it is a analog to an actual physical machine, in this case a computer. The computer is virtualized by taking the physical components of those and creating software copies of those or software implementations of those. And those software implementations emulate the actual physical components that you would have in a physical machine. And then they are assembled in much the same way a physical machine is. So you take all the software components that are virtualized and create a virtual machine out of those software components, and then you can have a machine that more or less mirrors the kind of hardware that you would have in a physical machine. Now in Azure there are 4 components that we can talk about as it relates to virtual machines, and these are things that you will need to be aware of whenever you're building virtual machines on Azure, because these are the things that Azure is going to ask you for whenever you start creating virtual machines. The first 2 I'm going to include together, and that would be CPU and RAM. Now CPU and RAM kind of come in pairs on Azure because you can't define them discrete of one another. Rather, you pick them together. And depending on the kind of VM you select within a given series depends on how much RAM and how many CPUs you will get. So there are different ratios that they define in a given class of VM on Azure. But the important thing is to remember is that generally speaking, the more cores you have, the more RAM you will get. So a machine with few cores is only going to have a small amount of RAM, and a machine with lots of cores is going to have a lot more RAM. So consider that whenever you go to select a virtual machine. Now there's a lot of different kinds of VMs on Azure, and we're going to go through those in another video later on to talk about the various kinds of VMs and the use cases for those VMs and the general rules of thumb for when you select those VMs. And you'll get a good idea of what VM to choose for what kind of task. But for now, just think about the RAM and the CPU coming together as a package deal on when you select a VM on Azure. The next component I want to mention is network interface cards, or NIC cards, on a virtual machine. Now, a virtual machine can have one or more NIC cards to connect to various network segments that you define on a virtual network. And this is how your virtual machine is going to talk to the internet, and it's also going to be able to talk to other virtual machines and components running on your virtual network. I can't go into details in this video about this subject because it is pretty large, and I want to do a separate video for that, so stay tuned to that. Just know that for now, you need at least one NIC card on a virtual machine, and you'll need to be able to configure that to connect to a virtual network, and that virtual network will then allow you to connect to other things on your virtual network and the internet itself. The next kind of component I want to talk about for Azure are storage components, and these are represented by disk or virtual hard disk, or VHDs as they're sometimes called. Now, a disk on Azure will come in one of 3 different kinds of flavors. The first one is an essential disk that you have on your machine, and that would be the operating system disk. Now this is where the operating system is installed, and you need that to boot the VM, obviously. So you absolutely must have the actual operating system disk to make a virtual machine work on Azure. You can also use the OS disk for storage and to software installation too, if you don't want to have the next kind of disk, which would be a data disk. Now, the data disks on Azure are not essential to make the machine work, but they do add some value to the actual virtual machine because they can improve the performance of data operations on your virtual machine. And these virtual disks that are storage disks can be set up as RAIDs, or they can be used to divide up the actual workloads that are being written and read from on the actual virtual machine to improve performance. So if your database supports something like sharding, for instance, and you want to shard out to different disks, might be a good way to handle that on Azure by creating independent disks that can be treated independent of one another, so you get better read-write operations on those and faster access to your data. Now, regardless of how you use these data disks, they can come in all shapes and sizes, and they can be attached and removed from the VM, and they can be attached and to other disks, other virtual machines as well on Azure. So you can treat them in much the same way you would a traditional hard drive, in that you can actually remove a hard drive from a physical machine and attach it to another machine. Same thing's true on Azure. You can take a virtual hard drive or virtual disk, remove it from a VM, and reattach it to another one. You can copy them, you can image them, you can back them up, you can do all those kinds of things with operating system disks and with storage disks. There is a third kind of disk on Azure that you cannot remove, you cannot copy, and you can't really remove from the virtual machine, and it's a temporary storage disk. Now, this is important to bring up because the temp storage on Azure VMs is a local storage that is volatile, so when the machine shuts down, it's erased. But this temp storage is high-speed local storage that is low latency and high throughput on the virtual machine, and it's nice to have that if you need to do things with like temp files or temp DBs or other things like that on a virtual machine. It's provided as a convenience to all Azure virtual machines for the purpose of doing temporary disk operations that you probably wouldn't want to do over the network to your storage disk or to your operating system disk. Rather, you can do it on that temp disk, and it'll make your machine a lot faster and more responsive for things like temp files and temporary databases and those kinds of things. While we're on the topic of storage, I'm going to go over the various kinds of disks you can attach to your VMs on Azure. The first kind are standard HDDs or standard hard disk drives, and these would be your traditional spinning disk that you have maybe in your laptop or your desktop, something very similar to that, and they have platters with moving heads that have to read from those platters. So the trade-off for these is, while they are very inexpensive, they have a higher latency for reading data and writing data to than other things like SSDs, which we'll talk about in a moment. But they are very economical for storing things, and they're very useful for storing data that you don't have to access very often, or very useful for data that doesn't get written to a lot or as well. So these are kind of the entry-level disks that you might want to consider whenever you're doing maybe some POC work or tests, or using it for like web servers that don't get hit often or things like that. The next class of disk are standard solid-state disks. Now, standard solid-state disk will have the same kind of IOPS or input-outputs per second as standard HDDs will, and even some of the same write speeds for throughput. But the difference here is these don't have the kind of latency that you would have on the disk that you would have with a spinning disk. And so these are better than a standard hard disk for the kinds of operations for writing and reading. And these are also very good for writing small bits of data and reading small bits of data, which would bog down a standard hard disk drive. But a solid state drive doesn't suffer from that like a standard HDD would, because a standard solid state disk can access small bits of data much more quickly than a standard hard disk drive. On top of the standard SSDs, you have premium SSDs. Now, the premium SSDs have all the advantages that a standard solid state disk would have, but these are much faster, and so they're going to have lower latency, better IOPS, and a better throughput than their standard SSD counterparts. But the same rules apply. They have lower latency in terms of reading and writing files than a standard hard disk spinning disk would have. Now, in preview, there are Ultra SSDs. Now, Ultra SSDs have much higher IOPS and much higher throughput than the premium SSDs, and these are currently in preview as of Q1 of 2019. And once they're out of preview, they'll go GA, so they'll be available for general consumption. But for now, these disks, while they're in preview, can be accessed and for test purposes. But I do want to make you aware of them, because these offer almost an order of magnitude of better performance over the previous generation of premium SSDs, and they might even have some sub millisecond latency times on them as well. So looking forward to having these ultra solid state disks available for applications on Azure. When it comes to choosing a disk, you also have to choose an operating system to go with that disk for the OS disk on your virtual machine. Now, the two biggest options on Azure are obviously going to be Windows and also Linux. Now, Linux comes in a lot of different distros. You have Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you have CentOS, you have Ubuntu, you have Debian, and a myriad of other options in the Linux camp as well. But one of these two options are almost always going to be your choice of operating system in Azure. Now, there's a small niche for things like BSD and other operating systems that might be more obscure, but the lion's share is definitely going to be either Windows or Linux VMs. And in some cases, if you can't find the option that you're looking for on Azure, you can also bring your own operating system. Now, by doing this, what you're essentially going to do is create a VHD locally on your desktop or on your server, then upload that image to Azure and then attach that disk to a virtual machine on Azure so that you can have a very customized experience within your virtual machine. Regardless of which one of these options you choose, you need to at least have some kind of operating system to boot your VM from. Well, today we've done a deep dive into Azure VMs, and we looked at the components that we need to build a VM with. We've looked at the kinds of storage available on them. Next time, we're going to go through the various series of VMs on Azure, and we're going to talk about what they're intended for and then how you can use them to address your application needs. So until next time, thanks for watching.
If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintelect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintelect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintelect on Twitter at WintelectNow or at Wintelect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintelect.com. Until next time, thank you.